I'm Red, and before we begin, I need you to understand something. The story you think you know about Chernobyl is incomplete. The explosion, the glow in the sky, the ghost city of Pripyat, that is only the beginning. What came after is darker, more deliberate, and far more disturbing. Because after the reactor exploded, the Soviet Union made a decision. They would fight a nuclear fire not with machines, but with human bodies. 600,000 of them. And then, when it was over, they would erase what they had done. This is the story of the Chernobyl liquidators, the men and women sent into a radioactive hellscape with no protection, no warning, and no future. And a government that buried them twice. At 1:23 in the morning, on April 26, 1986, Reactor No. 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in northern Ukraine ceased to exist as a controlled structure. It exploded. Not metaphorically. The reactor core itself was physically destroyed, firing a column of radioactive smoke and debris miles into the night sky. What remained was an open nuclear wound, bleeding radiation directly into the atmosphere. The cause? According to declassified Soviet records and subsequent international investigations, was a combination of a fatal reactor design flaw and a safety test carried out in violation of proper procedure. The explosion released what investigators later calculated to be the equivalent of 500 Hiroshima bombs worth of radiation into the atmosphere. 50 million curies of radioactive material, cesium, strontium, plutonium, began drifting west across Europe. And in Moscow, the men who needed to know most were told the least. When General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev received the first call that morning, the message delivered to him was precise in its deception. There had been an explosion and a fire, but the reactor itself was intact. It was not intact. It had ceased to exist. That lie, told in the first hours, set the template for everything that followed. The Soviet state needed the disaster contained, not because it cared about the people of Ukraine or Belarus, but because an uncontrolled nuclear fire threatened to trigger a second, catastrophic explosion. One that, according to some Soviet scientists' internal assessments at the time, could have rendered much of Europe uninhabitable. So, the call went out across the Soviet Union. Soldiers, miners, firefighters, engineers, construction workers, helicopter pilots, physicists, medics. They came from every republic, every city, every background. Over the next 4 years, 600,000 people were mobilized into what the Soviet government called the liquidation of the Chernobyl disaster. That is where the name came from. They were the liquidators. They were sent to dig tunnels beneath the melting reactor to prevent it from burning into the water table. They were sent onto the roof of the building to manually throw pieces of radioactive graphite off the edge with shovels. They were sent into the exclusion zone to slaughter contaminated animals. They were sent to bury entire villages, not evacuate them, but bury them, covering contaminated topsoil with clean earth. Many were given no dosimeters to measure their exposure. Those who were given dosimeters were sometimes ordered to falsify the readings, to record lower doses than the instruments actually showed. Some men went back into the zone day after day, week after week, because their official dose records said they hadn't reached the threshold yet, even as their bodies told a different story. The Soviet Union did not merely fail to protect its liquidators, it actively concealed what was being done to them. This was not negligence, it was policy. Classified documents, only accessible after the USSR's collapse in 1991, revealed that the Soviet Ministry of Health and Ministry of Defense issued direct orders to medical personnel. The diagnosis of acute radiation syndrome was not to be entered into the medical files of liquidators. Doctors across the Soviet Union were instructed to substitute alternate diagnoses: cardiovascular disease, cancer of unknown origin, general illness. The radiation connection was to be invisible in the record. This directive was not theoretical. Between 1988 and 1991, a secret government decree formally prohibited Soviet physicians from listing radiation as a cause of death for any affected individual. The man who signed that decree was Boris Sherbina, the Soviet deputy prime minister who had personally overseen the Chernobyl response from within the exclusion zone. Sherbina received enormous radiation doses during his time at the site. He died in 1990. His official cause of death? Unspecified. The machinery of concealment consumed even the men who operated it.
The physical cost imposed on the liquidators was severe, and for many, irreversible. Thousands developed acute radiation syndrome, a condition that destroys the body's immune system, causes organ failure, and produces symptoms so extreme that the men who survived described them as feeling their bodies dissolving from within. Beyond the acute cases, liquidators experienced dramatically elevated rates of thyroid cancer, leukemia, cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and neurological damage. Records suggest at least 3,000 cases of thyroid cancer were diagnosed through the 1990s in children under 14 in the three most affected nations: Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, in the populations nearest the fallout. The adult liquidators' long-term toll remains disputed and deliberately obscured, but independent researchers and survivor organizations have estimated that tens of thousands have since died from Chernobyl-related conditions. When the men who survived returned home, many discovered that their government had reclassified their medical histories. Their radiation exposures had been officially reduced on paper. They could not claim compensation they were owed because their records showed doses too low to qualify. They could not receive treatment for radiation-linked illnesses because those illnesses had been given other names. Some liquidators spent years trying to prove to the same state that had sent them into the fire that the fire had burned them.
Chernobyl did not end in 1986. It did not end when the sarcophagus, the enormous concrete shell poured over the destroyed reactor by liquidator hands, was completed in late 1986. It did not end when the new safe confinement, a structure costing 1.5 billion euros, was placed over the crumbling original sarcophagus in 2016. As of this year, 2026, 40 years after the explosion, the reactor core still contains an estimated 200 tons of molten nuclear fuel. It has not cooled. It has not stabilized. The liquidators who poured their lives into containing it bought the world time, and the world has not finished paying that debt. In February 2025, a Russian military drone struck the new safe confinement dome, rupturing its structure. The dome, built to protect Europe from another radioactive release, was damaged by an act of war over the same ground where 600,000 men and women had sacrificed their health to prevent exactly that outcome. Historians and nuclear scientists have described this as an act of nuclear recklessness without modern precedent. The liquidators built a tomb, and now that tomb is under siege. Today, many surviving liquidators live in poverty. Recognition came late, came incomplete, and came after many of them were already gone. They are called heroes in Ukraine now, but heroism is a word the living assign to the dead. The men who walked onto that roof, the men who dove into contaminated water, the men who shoveled graphite with their bare hands because their government told them to, and because if they didn't, the consequences would be unthinkable. They were not soldiers in any formal sense. They were human shields, conscripted into a war against physics itself by a state that would spend the next decade pretending they had never been harmed. The Soviet Union is gone, but what was done to the Chernobyl liquidators, the erasure, the falsified records, the secret decrees, that happened. It is documented. It is real. It should not be forgotten.
Every video on this channel is built the same way. Real events, real people, real darkness. No fabrication, no sensationalism. Only history that refuses to be buried. I'm Red, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment if you think the Chernobyl disaster is likely to become a new problem in today's world, full of wars. And I'll see you in the next one.